Okay, so welcome to the monthly satsang at Awakening Together. Our guest today is Professor Pierce Salguero. I'm great you're here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Yvonne. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So there's a lot to say, and just before we start, I want to say that this is the first part of two parts of this satsang because we realize there's much to say, and we want to give you an opportunity to really dive deep into it. So we start today by introducing Pierce, who to the people who might not know him, and I'm going to just read a quick bio so you get an idea. So Pierce Salguero has studied spirituality through decades of practice and scholarship, specializing in hatha yoga, meditation, shamanic rituals, spirit healing, Thai medicine, and Buddhist philosophy. His academic credentials include BAs in anthropology and cognitive science, an MA in East Asian studies, and a PhD in history of Buddhist medicine. He is now a professor researching Asian history, religions, and healing traditions. He likes to say that he is a student, friend, and fan of spirituality, but also a researcher, a skeptic, and a critic. He's going to share with us a framework he calls Multidharma, distilling the lessons from a lifetime of exploration of spirituality presented in a digestible way for modern seekers. There's a lot in that already. And yeah, I just hand it over to you, Pierce, so you can just start wherever you feel like you want to start today.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Yvonne. And hi to everybody. It's nice to meet you. Glad to see you here. Yeah, I guess I would just start by saying that this is like what we talk about today is independent from my role as a professor. It's not I'm not here in my capacity, as a professor with my employer, sort of like overseeing what I'm talking about here. I'm just here as a personal individual talking about, my own experience and ideas. I do research in spirituality and related topics, but this model is really coming out of my own experience and my own kind of, yeah, I guess my own, my own digestion of all of this material that I've been consuming, reading and researching, but also my own experience, conversations with friends, all sort of like combined together to produce this model of multi-dharma that we're talking about today. So I think what we wanted to do today was kind of give an overview of the model, kind of sort of this new interpretation or new map of the spiritual territory, give an overview of it, and I think what I probably want to do to start out maybe is just to really emphatically like the starting point for this whole conversation, and I'll probably refer to it a bunch of times while we're talking, and it's like the one thing I want people to really understand before we talk about anything is that this is just a map. It's just a model. I'm not actually going to attempt to describe ultimate reality. I'm not making any attempt to, argue what truth is or to, argue any particular perspective. It's just kind of like a way of speaking, a way of understanding, a way of kind of zooming back and getting a sense of the whole territory of spirituality. And it might make sense and kind of click for some people, and it may not, and that's totally fine. I'm not presenting this as a new religion or a new ideology that you have to accept. It's just kind of a something to try on and see if it helps to make sense of your experience, make sense of, other people's experience or not. And you can feel free to take it or leave it as you see fit. So I think that's a good place to start. Do you wanna ask me questions, Yvonne, and go back and forth, or do you want this to be more like a lecture kind of?
I'm,
Because I
I'm happy to do
could just
both.
like hit play and start talking.
The first question that arose for me was like, why a new model? I mean, you studied traditions, you know that there are a lot of models out there, thousands of years of modeling and mapping. And so you came up with a new model. How is that?
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, as you said, there's many different religious traditions, contemporary spiritual communities, and models and teachings and so forth. And I find that there's there's two things that I find to be difficult about those kinds of existing models. So one of them is in contrast with what I was just saying, most of these maps take themselves to actually be the truth. They take themselves to actually be the territory. They claim a certain authority, a certain kind of absolutism, and then often people will take these models and turn them into a dogma, kind of a fundamentalist sort of position about reality. People who have had these experiences that are on the map are enlightened or wise, and people who have other kinds of experiences that aren't on this map are not. So there's kind of hierarchies built into it. There's kind of judgments built into it. There's insider outsider communities and defending that turf and those boundaries, and it turns into, I think, a whole kind of difficult difficult political situation that causes more harm than good. So that's one problem with a lot of maps. Is that they kind of take themselves too seriously, I think. Um, and then the other kind of thing that I didn't really fit well with personally in terms of the maps of awakening process or the maps of spirituality that are out there is that they all adopt a similar metaphor when they're talking about the spiritual path. And the metaphor is that there is a series of stages or steps that you pass through as you move along through an awakening process. And so, whether it's Buddhist maps or Hindu maps or contemporary maps, there's often with these maps, there's an effort to try to explain your own experiences by fitting yourself into whatever stage it is or level it is on this map. So like I'm in stage two, you're in stage five, somebody else is in stage seven. Um, and 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 for me personally, as somebody who's had a very wide range of different kinds of spiritual experiences, I've been interested in spirituality and practicing since I was a very young teenager and have had all kinds of different experiences. And I've seen that different kinds of practices lead to different kinds of experiences. I've never really that's never really sat well with me, that there's kind of like a one, two, three, four, five, six, seven kind of progression from point A to, point Z. For me, my experiences have been a lot more fluid, a lot more blended, a lot more mixed together, a lot more confusing, seeming to jump around in different places and maybe not so linear. And so that kind of like linear progressive stage-based map making metaphor has never really done much for me. So I guess both of those things are kind of the starting point for why a new map. So, what I've attempted to do, and I've written this up in more detail than we're going to be able to cover in our conversation today. So I've written it up in it's about something like a 55 pages document that's on the website multidharma.net. And what I've attempted to do there is to create a way of thinking about spirituality that is both both capacious enough, spacious enough to make room for all sorts of different kinds of experiences and not place them on kind of a hierarchical value. And then also, it doesn't take itself very seriously, and doesn't claim to be the ultimate truth, right? So in both, I'm trying to create a model that will sort of not fall into those two traps that I just outlined.
And what I also like about it is that at the same time, you don't dismiss the old traditions. They are included. It's not like this is the better new model, forget all the old stuff. What you did with your model is that you used all the traditions and all the methods and you put them together and you said every method has its right in a certain point in the path. And so that for me is the beauty, that it's so inclusive and yeah, welcoming.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly right. So it's not a replacement of anybody's practice or anybody's tradition that they're or anybody any of the other maps. It's not a erasing of that and an imposition of a new model. You can think of it as like a meta model, a model that's going to sort of like be an umbrella that's going to show you how, these Buddhist models and these Hindu models and these Taoist models and these other models all kind of like where they overlap, where they don't overlap, where they're oriented towards different things, where they're oriented towards the same things. And so it sort of like sits over top of all of those other maps and kind of gives us a general orientation to the spiritual territory and a neutral kind of language to talk about things, um, non-hierarchical, neutral language that can allow us to talk about all of these traditions at the same time without, collapsing them into one another or making claims about one being better than the other. Yeah.
Mm. So the core of the Multidharma website and also the model is the threads. So the threads instead of the stages, you just talked about the stages and the former traditions that you have like one, two, three, four. And now we have something that you called threads. So what is a thread?
Yeah, so it's just a different metaphor, right? So we're used to the kind of the stages metaphor, which is like, stage one, stage two, stage three, stage four. Think of it as like vertical kind of like, you're cutting up the awakening process vertically, um, creating these kind of like locations or areas or kind of, stages that people are in. This model is going to cut horizontally instead. It's just cutting up things in a different way. And so rather than looking at discrete stages of development, it's looking at long-term trajectories that run throughout an awakening process and identifying four, maybe five, it's like four and a half trajectories or lines of development, or you could say themes of development that run across an awakening process. And so the fundamental idea is that certain traditions, certain teaching systems, certain practice communities value certain threads over others. So some communities are dedicated to one thread, some interweave two or three, or maybe all four, or maybe all four and a half threads. They interweave them all together. And different traditions will kind of they'll language that differently. They'll have different pointers, different kinds of vocabularies, different kinds of practices. But sometimes traditions have similarities because they're both working on the same thread. Sometimes they have differences because they're working on different threads. And it's a way of kind of just identifying what those core trajectories or themes are across different traditions. So the four threads are I played around with a lot of different names. Really what I would like to do is, talk for an hour about each one of them, but I have to give them a name, right? I have to choose like one word to refer to each one of them to give them a name. So for better or worse, maybe I should have named them one, two, three, four, or like yellow, red, green, and whatever. But I named the four emptiness, oneness, energy, and psyche. And these are four different sort of like categories of practice, four different ways of approaching spirituality, ways of approaching awakening or spiritual development. There are four different kind of types of experiences that you can have and movements that you can move in as you work with spiritual growth and tradition. And they have four different ideal outcomes, right? The like the imagined hero at the end of the spiritual development path is different in those four threads. Um, yeah, so each thread is sort of like a whole world unto itself. Each thread also has its own views about reality. So different traditions differ on what reality actually is, what absolute truth really is. They differ from one another. So each thread has kind of like an ontology, meaning like a representation of what's real, that's different. And they each have different, perspectives and different kinds of identities that arise as you are working spiritually with those different threads. So they're fundamentally quite different from one another. But for many people, they intertwine in interesting ways. So people who are working within traditions that value the intertwining of certain threads, will work in that way. A lot of people these days are doing awakening practices or spiritual practices in a very kind of eclectic way. We have access now in the 20th century to all of these traditions via the internet, via YouTube, via all these different kind of international teachers and so forth. And so people are often participating in like going out and gathering up practices from different traditions and mixing together things in their own unique kind of idiosyncratic ways. And that creates new kinds of braiding or new kinds of weaving, interweaving of threads that we've never seen before in history. And so your experience might be, very different as a 21st century spirituality practitioner than it would have been, back in the fifth century in Thailand or something like that, where there was more of a monoculture, right? You just had access to what was in your local area. So now we have access to all these different ideas and practices and so forth. And so I think we need a new model. I think we need a new, more capacious, more inclusive model of spirituality than these traditions have necessarily offered to us. Um,
Mm.
so, and I'm saying that, you introduced me as a fan and a critic of spirituality. I'm both. I really, really value the traditions and the perspectives that traditions have brought, the practices that they've preserved over time. Absolutely amazing. The communities that have, carried these practices forward are just really, they should be the object of intense gratitude for all of that work. And at the same time, I'm also a critic. I can also see that we need an upgrade. We need a better theoretical framework for understanding spirituality today. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to offer. I just noticed in the chat that Tina mentioned, like they have their own ecosystem, and that's actually one of my favorite metaphors to use. And so I'll just quickly like riff on that for just a sec. Um, which is to like take an ecosystem like the African savanna, right? And we would not go to that ecosystem and complain that the elephants are not acting like the lions and the lions are not acting like the giraffes and everybody should be the same, right? We can appreciate when it comes to ecosystems how each creature is filling a unique evolutionary niche in the environment and they all have their own role to play, right? And we can appreciate that diversity. We also appreciate that when it comes to sports. um, you know, Not everybody should be a swimmer. Like different people's bodies are configured differently. Some people are built to be Olympic swimmers. Some people are built to be Olympic gymnasts. And like a short and flexible, gymnast, you put them in the swimming pool, then they're not going to be able to compete, and vice versa. A big stocky swimmer is not going to be able to compete, right? But we celebrate that. We think it's amazing that humans have all these different capacities and skills. The same in the arts. We look at the arts and we're like, wow, there's painters, different styles. There's musicians, there's dancers. Nobody said Picasso should have been a dancer, right? All artists, the dance is the best art, and everybody needs to be a dancer. That's ridiculous. We appreciate the diversity of these ecosystems when it comes to the natural world, when it comes to sports and arts, but then in spirituality, many people take this kind of fundamentalist dogmatic position. Everybody should be having the same experiences in the same way, interpreting it in the same way, believing the same things. And if they don't, they're wrong, right? And whether you're in a fundamentalist religion or you're in a fundamentalist spiritual community, I think those kinds of attitudes are unhelpful. They can lock us into unhealthy, unskillful viewpoints, and they can also create, problems and tensions with society, with our colleagues and friends. So yeah, so ecosystems thinking, I think, is definitely one helpful metaphor to bring to what we're talking about today.
And maybe just adding to this, we will go into the threads. That was another question in the chat. Of course, we will introduce the chats more, the threads more in detail. You also did a study about spiritual emergencies. And I think that's one of the reasons, to me, that's very logical that you came up with the model, because spiritual emergencies often arise when people have experiences and they have no context and they have no people who support them in what they're going through. And that often happens when you have like a dogmatic view, like a very narrowed view. And then you sit there and you have a Kundalini awakening, and no one tells you because you're in a Buddhist tradition, for instance, right? So,
Yeah, that is the kind of the bridge for me between my scholarly work and what I'm talking about now. For me, that bridge was it came in the form of research on spiritual emergencies or spiritual crises, and realizing that the research, the scholarship is, both from psychology, from other fields, is telling us how critical context is for people to navigate difficult experiences, difficult, challenging experiences in spirituality. So, like you said, it can happen that somebody has zero context whatsoever and they have a spontaneous awakening. Maybe they go to a mindfulness class or something, they're expecting to reduce their stress, and suddenly they're having experiences of disintegration of the self or kundalini, all sorts of stuff. They have no context for it. They're not expecting it. They know nothing about it. That can be extremely destabilizing, very difficult. Another possibility is that you are in one kind of awakening community that values certain kinds of experiences, and then you're doing these practices expecting to have those, and suddenly you're having a quite different kind of experience that doesn't make sense in your community. Maybe you go to the teachers and you explain it to them, and they sort of belittle your experience, or they dismiss it, or they gaslight you into thinking that you're just sort of delusional, or other kinds of dismissive reactions to your experience. And we know from the research, and maybe people know from their personal experience, that those kinds of reactions and lack of context, lack of support is, yeah, not only disheartening, but actually can be quite dangerous. People can spiral into fear, into anxiety, into thinking that they're going crazy, and the kind of the panic around that can make things worse. People can understand, if people are understanding their experiences as mental health crisis, then it likely will devolve into a mental health crisis. Whereas if people have a context in which they're able to interpret these experiences as awakening, then they might have extremely positive experience of the exact same kind of phenomenon. So I think the the need for a more capacious model that doesn't make hierarchies, that doesn't dismiss people's experiences, but actually makes space for a variety of different kind of awakenings, and understands and values those kinds of experiences. That kind of map can actually, I hope, be really helpful for people who are in sort of that no man's land of doubting what's going on, not really understanding what's happening with them, not knowing where to turn, not knowing who to reach out to, not knowing sort of not being able to have their experience validated. I'm hoping that this model, by reading it or listening to me talk about it, or talking with you about it or whatever, that this can provide people with the kind of the orientation. You get a map and it's like, oh, the territory that I'm now going through is actually on the map. It's not some kind of, off the map, thing that only I'm experiencing, that nobody else has ever heard of. And just that alone, I think, can be helpful.
yeah, and what came up when we already chatted about it, Pierce, is that it's not just for people who are on the spiritual path and have these experiences, but it could also be helpful for communities, for teachers, for mentors, for coaches, because if they know this is the territory and this is the thread. This is the part I'm covering with my work. But you hear something from your client and then you go like, nah, that's not my territory. But I know someone who knows. And then I can send them to the other person. And to me, that's also like in the professional world, it can be really helpful to have an overview over the whole territory, to know where your work is part of, and then to have a network with others who cover different threads. And then you get really like a beautiful like synthesis of different people and methods.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. I don't call the plumber to come in and address an electric problem in my house, right? I don't call the electrician when there's a problem with the plumbing, right? So it's a matter of knowing, what your specialization is, as a teacher, knowing just what is your specialization, what thread are you an expert in, what part of the thread are you an expert in, even we can talk about that. Um, and just instead of dismissing experiences that don't fit on your thread, knowing that there are other specialists out there who do specialize in those things, and being able to refer your students, to other kinds of expertise is really just kind of like that's what we do in ordinary life, right? It's what we do when our car's broken, when we go to different kind of doctors for different parts of our body, right? It's what we do in ordinary life. We seek out expertise in different areas, and we don't expect one person to know everything about everything. But yet, when it comes to spirituality, for some reason, we do things differently, and we just get in our heads that like there's that one teacher, that's the person who knows everything, that's the person who's really enlightened, that's the tradition that knows everything about everything. All the other traditions are wrong or subpar in some way. And I don't know why still we are having that same kind of relationship with spirituality, after all of these centuries, but we are, and we're creating ontologies out of these systems, right? Out of these practice experiences. Ontologies are like models of reality. So then it's like, oh, that teacher said that they had a near-death experience and they saw, all these angelic beings in heaven. And so that's true. And if I'm not seeing that, I'm not seeing what's actually true. I'm not a good person. I'm not awakened. I'm, whatever, whatever, whatever. And it's just creating kind of like rigid worldviews, and then judging yourself and other people based on these ontologies. We're doing that in spirituality, even when we don't do it in 99% of the other parts of our lives.
Yeah,
Yeah.
completely agreed. So, shall we dive into the threads, and starting with the emptiness thread, which is the first thread as well on your website,
Yeah.
and the most common one
Let
in,
me let me back up even a little bit before that,
yeah,
and just start with like, what do I mean by awakening? Because I've already used the word. I'm going to use the word. Um, and I think different traditions, different people have a different idea about that term, and so I want to just clarify what I mean by awakening. So I find like each one of the threads defines awakening in their own mode, and I want to have a more capacious, more kind of general definition of awakening. For me, an awakening experience is an experience of kind of popping out of the narrative self, or the everyday self, or the separate self, or the ego self. People have different words for this. That most people in our society, most people in the world are fused into an identification, and a whole world that centers around this narrative self, this egoic self, right? And they're identified with all of their roles and their capacities. I'm a father, I'm a professor, I'm this, that, or the other, right? There's a very sort of like tight identification with those roles, and the world really centers around that small self and its relationships with others. And an awakening process is, for me, the the popping out of the identification with that small self and having that identity land somewhere else in a kind of a meta level, like a higher up level of identity. I'm saying it in a generic way because each thread has its own version of it. And so you could pop out of the narrative self and your identity becomes I am awareness. It could be I am consciousness. It could be like, oh, I am God. It could be I am nothing. It could be I am a soul. I am a spirit. I am a it could be all kinds of different things, right? That your new identity sort of lands in this bigger identity. And now you can see that the narrative self, the separate self, the ego self was actually kind of like an illusion or a delusion or a kind of a very narrow kind of constriction of your identity. And now you have this more kind of broad, wider, more liberated, more capacious identity than you did before. So for some people that can happen quite dramatically, like a big fireworks, like explosive kind of experience. Other people, it's a very kind of like gradual shifting, very gradual kind of extraction out of the narrative self into this new identity. And it happens very sort of like smoothly over time. Um, and then a lot of people experience sort of like a popping out and then a re-identification and then popping out again and a re-identification, right? So it can kind of like fluctuate. But once that identity sort of firmly lands in a larger view of oneself, whatever that view is, I call that an awakening. And so it's not I want to emphasize it's not an intellectual exercise. It's not a philosophical exercise. It's not like, oh, I can see how my body is interconnected with the earth and with the elements and with other beings. That's more of a head-based kind of philosophy or understanding. This what I'm talking about is a shift in the identity. So it's like you actually feel like, oh, I am, Gaia, or I am the cosmos, or I am like you really feel yourself to be life itself, or something like that. So it's a visceral, embodied, perceptual transformation that takes place. A lot of times it takes place because there's specific practices that are designed to make that shift happen. A lot of times it just happens spontaneously to people for whatever reason that we don't really understand. Um, some people just kind of like pop into something like that. Um, so I'm calling that kind of experience an awakening. And then where that new identity lands is the beginning of a thread, is the kind of the opening of a thread. There's like, in my view, there's four different places that can land. And then it opens up kind of a trajectory of deepening into that new identity, deepening into the experience, the phenomenology of that awakened identity. And then, so there's four different places you can start and four different kind of trajectories that you can go down. Um, so that's kind of like starting point before we
What
get.
what co- what comes to mind too is that we talked also about yeah, I don't know the word, epiphenomena. Is that the word? Like you can have experiences that are very spiritual, very intense, like a Kundalini awakening or any other thing, or being an energy worker maybe, but still not having a thread open. So I think that's also good to differentiate between the two.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, that's right. So, yeah, so you can have all kinds of different experiences. If you engage, I mean, honestly, if you engage in these practices, especially if you're engaging in like the traditional ones that have been handed down for centuries, and you engage in them at a certain high level of, a certain high dosage, right? You're like doing, several hours of practice a day. You're going to experience all kinds of stuff, right? These practices are they're they're preserved and they are taught and they are honored and valued for a reason that they work. Now, not every practice works for every person. You have to find the practices that are going to work for you. But if you put together a suite of practices, that are and you're doing them with sufficient dedication, you're going to be able to have all kinds of experiences. Um, they don't involve the popping out of the identity and landing in a new place and a new kind of higher level, higher order identity. If it doesn't involve that visceral, perceptual shift that I was just talking about, then for me it's not an awakening. So yeah, so you could be, I don't know, practicing Reiki, let's say, and suddenly you realize that you can feel energies and you can, feel energies in your hands. When you're working with people, you can feel their energy, you can feel your energy, maybe you start to be able to feel the energy of trees, you start to feel the energy of, I don't know what, ghosts, the sun, whatever. That's not an awakening. That's just more receptivity to energy. That is not what I mean by an awakening of the energy thread, because it's not an awakening experience. Um, an awakening experience would be a shift, like popping out of your identity, and seeing, really experiencing the yourself as energy, who you are as energy, and really really like having a new conception of who you are, being, I am this field of energy, and now experiencing your life through that new identity, through that perspective. Now we're talking about an awakening experience. I guess I started with energy, but just to say the other ones, the usually when I talk about these, I start with emptiness, and that's only because of my background being most like philosophical background, having more to do with Buddhism than other traditions. So it just felt for me natural to start with emptiness. It doesn't have to start with any one of them. So today I started with energy, which is fine. Um, so emptiness would be when your identity pops out of the narrative self and lands in non-self, like there is no self, or I am the void, or I am emptiness, or I am nothingness. Um, that's a that's a an emptiness thread awakening. A oneness thread awakening is, a new identity that is like the opposite. It's I am everything. Uh, I am awareness and everything is awareness, or I am God and everything is part of me, or I am the cosmos and every last, particle in the cosmos is who I am, or I am life, right? And all of life. Um, right. So there's kind of an expansion. So the emptiness thread is like the disappearance of the self, and this is the oneness thread is like the expansion of the self to include everything. Energy thread, I am energy, I'm a field of energy, right? And then the psyche thread, the fourth thread is this one we'll come back to, get into more detail about it, but the psyche thread is some aspect of the unconscious part of the psyche that you now see yourself as being identified with this larger entity that has come out from the unconscious part of your own mind, right? So I am my soul, or I am this whole capacity to have all of these different kinds of parts and pieces of me that all are part of this larger whole, or I am a spirit from the astral realms that has come down to this earth in order to be, in order to have this mission that I'm working out over lifetimes, something like that. Different people can express this really differently depending on their traditions, but it's some aspect of your own self that was previously unconscious now has come out and you now see that as your identity. So these are the four threads. The openings of the four threads is like the identification with that one of those four categories of things. Um, and it might be helpful before we get into like deepening and all the rest of the sort of the what happens after that. It might just be helpful to quickly just sort of identify some traditional viewpoints about um, awakening because most forms of Buddhism are really focused on techniques and practices that will provoke an awakening experience of the emptiness variety. So most forms of Buddhism are focused on like emptying out the self, non like I am emptiness or there is no self. And the practices, the philosophies, the orientations are mostly focused around that. In contrast to most forms of Hinduism or Hindu inspired, spiritual systems that are focused on oneness. They're focused on it's either I am awareness, which is everything, or I'm Brahman, which is everything, or I am God, or I am reality. I am the ground of being, right? All these terms, people use different terms, but they're all suggesting some kind of unity, some kind of oneness, which is very different than Buddhism. Um, and energy-based systems. So here I'm thinking of Taoism. I'm thinking of certain forms of tantric Buddhism and Hinduism. There's other traditions that are really working with the energy system, the subtle energy system, in order to awaken the energy system. Whether it's chakras or microcosmic orbits or whatever the tradition is, they're really emphasize working with energy in the body in order to have this kind of awakening where you realize that your body and mind are ultimately just energy, and it's this kind of like field of energy that is manifesting in as mental and physical phenomena, but it's ultimately energy. And then the psyche thread traditions. There's many of them. There's really radically different ways that they talk and language things and understand things. Um, on the one end, you have some Western psychology traditions, particularly well those that are inspired by Carl Jung. So Jungian psychology, and lots of offshoots, including most recently, I think, internal family systems. IFS is one of these kinds of systems where you can have an awakening where you are realizing, oh, I thought I was little Pierce. I thought I was this little like narrative self, but now I realize that I am so much of who I am is my unconscious or my shadow material or the collective unconscious in Jung's terms, or in IFS terms, like I thought I was this part, but now I realize I'm this space in which there's all these parts, right? So that's more of a psychology kind of languaging, but you can have psyche thread could also be expressed in terms of spirits, in terms of souls and spirits. And that would be more common in indigenous traditions, in shamanic traditions, native traditions where people talk about, realizing that they're a soul, that they have parts to this soul, realizing that the soul has a mission, the soul can, go through different bodies and is now here in this body in order to do a certain kind of task or certain kind of mission. The psyche thread can look like that. It can also look like a lot of New Age sort of Western spirituality that talks about like, being some kind of star being or some kind of some other kind of otherworldly being projected down onto Earth in order to become this human in order to sort of like play out a mission or to play out an idea of awakening. Um, lots of different things that can come up in the psyche thread, a lot of different ways people language that, a lot of different traditions that value that thread. Um, and then, kind of like because these different traditions have these different emphases with these threads, then they have different heroes at the end of the thread, right? So if you're in an emptiness thread tradition like Buddhism, like many forms of Buddhism, most forms of Buddhism, the hero at the end is this, monastic who's completely detached from everything and totally like, equanimous with the world and completely sort of like, uh, yeah, unattached and uninvolved. In the oneness thread, the hero of that would be, you know, uh, I don't know, somebody like Jesus, right? So Christianity, I didn't mention earlier, the Christian mysticism is definitely a oneness thread tradition where it's like all about, seeing your oneness with God, having that unity experience with God. And so Jesus, a figure like that who's just like totally one with God and also just like exuding compassion and love for the whole world, right? Like that's a real oneness thread hero. Energy thread hero is like the Taoist masters who, after a lifetime of perfecting their being able to work with chi or the energies of the universe, when they die, they sort of like ascend to heaven in a puff of smoke, like or vapors, like going up into the heavens. Or in Tibetan Buddhism, which is a sort of a energy thread form of Buddhism, you have the master like disappears in a flash of light and there's a rainbow that when the master dies there's like a rainbow that goes across the mountains and the master's body disappears because they've been transformed into pure light, which in that system is how they think about energy. um, and then you have heroes from the psyche thread tradition. It could be, depending on the tradition, it could be like a fully individuated, person. It could be like the shaman. It could be like the world soul who kind of like embraces and embodies the whole cosmos. Different heroes depending on the tradition. And then the last thing I'll say before I turn it back over to you, Yvonne, is that these these threads can be combined together. So I said most forms of Buddhism focus on the emptiness thread, but a lot of forms of Buddhism, so almost all forms of Buddhism focus on the emptiness thread, but a lot of forms of Buddhism weave that together with a sense of love and compassion and interconnectedness with all beings. That's more of a oneness thread perspective. And so the forms of Buddhism that do that will sort of combine those two threads in a particular way. Tantric forms of Buddhism would actually also then add the energy thread into that. And so they're weaving together three threads. Um, the yoga tradition is definitely like the Patanjali yoga tradition coming out of Hinduism is definitely an energy thread centric tradition, but it also weaves in a lot of emptiness into that. So it's just a way of kind of like orienting different traditions depending on what their focus is. And for me, I can kind of like look at traditions, even ones I haven't heard about before, sort of like listen to the way that they're talking about the awakening process. What does the awakening process involve, and where do you wind up? And I get a sense of like, oh, this seems like it's a oneness thread, or it seems like it's weaving together oneness with energy, or it seems like it's, maybe a psyche thread thing with a, touch of emptiness in it. Um, so I've gone through it really quickly, but hopefully that's kind of like clear enough to get a sense of sort of what the starting point is for the categorization. And then we can talk about you know, the deepening into the threads and how that unfolds. It unfolds differently with each thread because what each thread means by awakening and what each thread means by enlightenment is different. So um, yeah, so we can get in more into that. But how are we doing, Yvonne? Am I going on too much? Am I
It's perfect. We're still just having enough time for going on a bit more. There's some questions in the chat. We can first check the chat if you want before you
Oh
I'll tell
yeah, Joseph, thank you for Advaita Vedanta, which is I should have mentioned. So Advaita is a little bit of a weird, not weird, but a little bit of a hard to pin down character because it depends on who you're talking about. So there's like the classical Advaita from, you know, from the first millennium in India, and then there's Neo Advaita, which is the contemporary present day versions of Advaita with, you know, with based on teachings of people like Ramana Maharshi and Nisargadatta, and then there's people that call themselves Advaita that are doing sort of like different things, like the direct path people and these other people. So Advaita is a little bit all over the place. For me, it's just a matter of listening to what they are advocating. So if you are advocating self-inquiry, you know, who am I inquiry, let's say, if you're advocating doing that in order to see through the illusion of there being any kind of self whatsoever, that's more of an emptiness thing. If you're advocating doing the kind of that kind of self-inquiry because you want to see that you are awareness or you are consciousness and consciousness is everything, then that's more of a oneness thread kind of approach to Advaita. So listen to what people are teaching. Are they saying, you know, are they saying like, you know, everything is, you know, I am that? Are they saying I am that, which is I am everything, I am the all, I am the one, I am the, you know, the awareness is everything, awareness, everything is made out of awareness, everything arises in awareness. That's a oneness thread. If they're saying, you know, any kind of identity is a movement of thought, any kind of identification, you know, even I am this or that is a movement of thought, and should see through it, then that's more of an emptiness thread kind of style of Advaita. So yeah, so I think even within Advaita, you have people, you know, even within the same Advaita community, you have people using the same words in different ways. So it's a little bit confusing, I think, when it comes to it right then. Yeah. So should we where should we dive in, Yvonne?
I think it would be interesting to see then how the thing goes further. Like, I mean, your model is not a method. It's not saying this is the way you need to go. It's more like a descriptive model. It says, you know, this is the map. Check out where you are at. But at the same time, your model has the opening, like you said, then the deepening. Maybe you want to say more about the deepening and the endpoints, because when we have a trajectory, we have a starting point, and of course, we have an endpoint in
Sure,
every
sure.
trajectory. So we have four endpoints. Like people usually, when they go about awakening, they think there is one thing to reach. Like there's this one thing, and if I'm there, I'm done. But then with the threads model, you realize, okay, I had this deep, empty experience, but there's more because then you can have the same endpoint on oneness or energy or psyche. So maybe you want to talk about that a bit more.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks for keeping me in line and sort of like directing as well. I appreciate it. Um, Yeah, so you're right. My model isn't necessarily it's not a prescriptive kind of like t teaching, you know, in order for people to follow, in order to have awakenings and deepen and so forth. I mean, basically what I'm saying is I think there's fantastic tools out there in these different traditions, in these different practice systems. And if you're working on, if you're interested in oneness kind of experiences, oneness thread type awakenings, there's tons of stuff out there, right? We just talked about Advaita. I mentioned Christian mysticism. I mentioned, Hindu devotionalism. There's all kinds of, maybe Sufism. There's all sorts of different traditions that will teach you techniques and skills, and some of them are probably quite good. And some of them may not fit for you, but other ones, I'm sure could fit. Or it might just happen that you're not really a oneness thread type person. And so that these practices won't really ever result in very much kind of juice for you, but you can find the juice in another thread. Like you might be more oriented towards an energy thread, or you might be more oriented towards an emptiness thread. And so you can like practice those techniques and get farther than if you were practicing these techniques, right? So the model allows you to sort of like make sense of the landscape and see, you know, to go back to the metaphor earlier, it's like, oh, I thought I was a zebra and I was like hanging out with all those zebras trying to be one of those zebras, but it turns out I'm actually really a giraffe and I should be, practicing in the giraffe area, right? Um, yeah, or I thought I was a swimmer, but it turns out I'm more of a, soccer player, right? But like with my kids when they were little, we didn't know. Are you an artist? Are you an athlete? Are you going to excel in this, that, or the other? We have no idea. Why don't we just expose you to a whole bunch of stuff and then see kind of like where you kind of connect and start to deepen, right? And so one kid like, hated music lessons, the other one liked them. One kid hated, this, the other kid like that. And they sort of like, navigate and kind of latch on and deepen into things. And then you see what their natural inclinations and natural skills and abilities and natural talents and natural interests, you see where those are. And then they enter into a cultivation where they pick up those practices and they start to get even better, right? So it's the same thing with spirituality. I think we're going about it backwards if we're like looking out at the landscape and saying, which guru should I believe in, and which model should I think is the ultimate truth, and I'll choose that one and then start practicing. Like that's totally backwards. I think like just spread yourself out, practice all kinds of stuff, see where your natural talents and inclinations are, and then enter into cultivation, right? And if you discover something's not working, like that just may be, it may just be the energy thread isn't going to work for you, and you got to, have a different kind of approach, right? So the model isn't like going to give you specific like, oh, now you should practice this, right? It's just kind of like an orientation to that. Um, that being said, there is, for each one of the threads, I do have what I call the guiding question for the thread. And that to me, if you are working with a thread, I would say, if you've had an awakening experience with any of the threads, I would say the guiding question for that thread, regardless of what your practice is, you could be doing meditation or yoga or qigong or this, that, or the other, it doesn't matter. The orientation of your practice towards this guide could be towards this guiding question. And if you orient your practice towards the guiding question, it's going to deepen the thread more and more. And so just to go through them in the case of the emptiness thread. So emptiness is just like as you deepen, it's just more and more and more concepts, these kind of like gross level concepts, like big concepts, they sort of collapse. They're seen through. They're seen to just be thought. So it starts with the narrative self is just thought, and then it goes on from there. Other kinds of concepts, and the concepts can be quite fundamental, like time and space turn out to just be thoughts. Your orientation in space, where like I am here and other things are there. that turns out to be a thought. Um, your perception of things as being real and solid turns out to be a thought. Um, and so the guiding question for this thread is what still seems real? So let's say you had an awakening and you're like, oh, I realize I'm not the separate self. That separate self was just an illusion. But what still seems real? Well, it still seems like there's awareness. Okay. Is that really so? Is there such a thing as awareness? Is awareness actually real? Right. And so then you apply that sort of like guiding question to what seems real. And as you move down the emptiness thread, those realities will collapse one after another. Right. So it turns out awareness isn't real. Um, Now I think I'm seeing objects. I think I'm having perceptions. I'm having visions and hearing and body sensations. Is that really so? So you analyze it, you meditate on it, you use the tools of the emptiness thread, and that'll collapse too. Ultimately, things collapsing, one after another. The goal of the emptiness thread is an experience of the collapse of all of reality. And that's often in English described as a cessation. In different traditions, it could be called nirodha, it could be called nirvikalpa, it could be called nibbana, it could be called all kinds of different terms. But the kind of the shared feature of the experience is that just it's like all of reality just kind of collapses simultaneously. Both the subject and the objects, right? The viewer and the things that are viewed just kind of collapse, and there's a sort of like consciousness blanks out. And that's sort of like the the end of that line of inquiry. Like what still seems real at the bottom of the emptiness thread? Nothing. The answer is nothing is real anymore. Everything has been deconstructed. That's totally different than the oneness thread, right? So the oneness thread guiding question. So the oneness thread, again, this is like opening up into a broader identity, right? I am one, I am everything. Maybe you don't immediately go to I am everything. Maybe it's like I am life, right? But then as you deepen into the emptiness thread, that oneness gets more and more inclusive and you are more and more unified with everything. The guiding question is what still seems separate, right? So I am life and then there's inanimate objects. Well, is that really so? What still seems separate from this unity? And orienting your practice, whatever the practice is, Christian mysticism, Hindu, awareness-based practices from Advaita. It could be whatever, doesn't matter. But you're just kind of more and more inclusive. What still feels separate from this unity? Ultimately, at the far end of this thread, um, there's it's like everything is unified, and I'm experiencing that unity, right? So there's still like a very subtle separation of there being like an experiencer that's experiencing unity, right? So I'm somehow separate from the unity that I'm experiencing. And so at the bottom of this thread, there's the that subject object, duality is collapsed together, and there's just oneness. Nothing is outside of the unity. That's the bottom of the oneness thread. So you can see in both cases, in all cases, actually, there's a non-duality at the end of the thread, which is the subject object. There's neither a subject nor an object because both get kind of like unified. That duality is obliterated at the bottom of all of the threads. So in the emptiness thread, that duality is obliterated because everything disappears. In the bottom of the oneness thread, that duality is obliterated because everything is unified into one. In the energy thread, it's a deepening into more and more and more of reality being experienced as energy, being experienced as an energetic. So initially it might be there's energy in my body. I'm having an energetic, Kundalini kind of experience, and I'm realizing how much of this body and mind are composed of energy, but I still feel like I have a boundary to my body. The energy's inside my body, right? And then as you deepen into the thread, it's like the separation between inside and outside, or between the body and the rest of the universe. That separation, collapses. The question that you're orienting towards is what still seems solid, what still seems non-dynamic, right? Because energy is dynamic, and um, it's not solid at all, right? So what still seems solid, right? Oh, my body seems solid, but then that dissolves. So, and then there's kind of, the larger space. There's this field of energy, but the field feels like it has boundaries. Does it really? Those dissolve. Um, Ultimately at the bottom of this thread, it's like the others. You have like everything is a field of energy, but there's like an experiencer of that field of energy. And that experiencer, that subject, that's there viewing the objects, collapses, or becomes the subject, the viewer becomes also energetic, right? So you go from having like a stable viewer that's seeing the pulsations of the universe as energy, to now the viewer is also pulsating. So there's no solid ground anymore anywhere. That's the bottom of the energy thread. Bottom of the psyche thread. So moving down the psyche thread, it's what part of this psyche material, unconscious material, what part of my conditioning is still being held at an arm's length? What part of this conditioning, what part of this unconscious material isn't being welcomed, isn't able to come out and express itself? And so it may start, um, the psyche thread is really different depending on which model, which tradition you're in. But let's say you're in a tradition like a psychology tradition, maybe most people would be more familiar with that kind of language. I thought I was Pierce doing everything, but now I realize my how much of what I do is conditioned by my shadow, is conditioned by the collective unconscious. How much of what I experience is actually being driven by these unconscious processes. Then the question just becomes, well, what else is in there? What other kinds of conditioning are there? What else haven't I seen? Haven't I welcomed? What else am I afraid to welcome in? And so it may start with like personal traumas. It may go back to like childhood or like infancy or like even prenatal traumas. For a lot of people, it goes back to previous life sort of experiences, ancestral traumas, and then it can go to kind of animalistic conditioning, right? What kinds of conditioning do I have in my body because I'm a mammal, because I'm an animal? What kinds of conditioning do I have in this body because it's a biological organism with like hormones and gut microbiome and things like that? What kinds of conditioning? For a lot of people, it has some kind of like divine mission, some kind of like astral plane, programming, or it's some kind of like soul that has a mission to conduct on Earth. So like realizing what that is and having that come out and accepting it, um, accepting and welcoming more and more and more of the unseen, unknown, unprocessed conditioning, and having all of that come up more and more and more. Um, Bottom of the psyche thread is for these psyche based traditions, the bottom of the thread is seeing that all of reality, every last shred of reality, is being produced by my unconscious part of my psyche, being produced by my mind, being um, generated by my conditioning. So like 100% of all of my experience is generated from conditioning. And again, at that bottom of the thread, there's like the viewer and then the experience. There's the experiencer that sees that everything is conditioning, right? But then the realization is that the viewer, the experiencer is also conditioned. And then the whole thing sort of collapses into a non-dual sort of uh, yeah, the subject object collapses into non-duality. Um, so different traditions have different techniques for that, have different tools for that trajectory, have different ways of talking about that trajectory. Different values, different kind of signposts along the way, and so forth. But again, the model, the multi-dharma model is just kind of like painting the picture, kind of putting all of these traditions on the same even kind of like playing field, showing the structural similarities between them. They all involve an initial awakening shift. They all involve the opening of the thread. They all involve a deepening into the thread. And they all involve a non-duality, a non-dual outcome at the bottom of the thread, where every last shred of reality, every last shred of experience is seen through the lens of that particular thread. I just said a lot. So
Yeah. And when I listened, I was like, just like, let's say, coming to the end point of the emptiness thread. I mean, how many lifetimes does that take? Like, if you listen to what you just shared, it's like, oh my God, that's so much. And it looks like this could be the end of the model, like, getting to all these endpoints or even to one endpoint in one lifetime. Hey, that's great. But this is not the end of the model. The question is, do you want to go to the end of the model? Do you want to spend some time for questions? We have about 20 minutes left.
yeah, let me just I'll just wrap up by giving a preview of the sort of the end of the model, and then we can come back and
Yeah,
talk about that next
yeah,
time.
yeah,
So the but what you were just saying, it could take lifetimes to go down one of these threads. Yeah, I mean, many traditions have this idea of multiple lifetimes, and you can think of it that way, but it's also fairly common for people to have kind of explosive experiences and move down these threads really quickly in a matter of like years or even months. Different people, again, who knows why different people are going to have different kinds of experiences here. There's some people are going to like have a very gradual opening, very gradual, slow and steady kind of movement down the thread over a lifetime of practice. Other people, it could be like, nothing happens for 20 years and then boom, they have these like, huge experiences. Some people can like, pop down the thread in a couple of leaps. Other people can seem like they go all the way down to the end of the thread and then they come back and then back down again. It's kind of like a yo-yo. Um, all kinds of different ways that people experience this, and I think that accounts for a lot of the difference between people. The kind of the speed and the manner in which they go down the threads. So a lot of the difference between people is which threads they're going down, and another major piece of difference is another major um, factor in the difference is how exactly they're moving along the threads. Are they doing it steady? Are they kind of like all over the place? Is it fast? Is it slow? Um, but then to move forward, the other piece of it that is even more sort of like complicated or complicating the model is uh, the practices or traditions or maybe your own experiences when you have more than one thread that are open. So, like I was saying earlier, many traditions try to open two threads or three threads and work with them. And so there you might be experiencing one thread opening and then another thread opening and then even maybe a third thread opening. And some people have a fourth thread opening. And these then you have like a deepening experience in one and then in the other, and that triggers a deepening experience over here. And it's sort of like I call this a braiding process, right? Because the threads are sort of like which one's on top at any moment might be different. So for you, you might have, uh, all kinds of different experiences from different threads that are sort of, you know, chaotic, maybe. Somebody else, it might be more regular. It might be every 6 months they shift. It might be every couple of days. It could be really individually unique and different how these threads are interacting with one another in your own. Maybe your practice system coaches you through certain kinds of shifts in certain kinds of ways. Maybe you're just doing this yourself by piecing together practices, different practices, and you're having your own awakening experience. And then there's just sort of like it can be really messy and really chaotic. Um, but the idea is that through this braiding process, if you do have more than one thread kind of working operational through this braiding process, the threads ultimately will come to kind of integrate together. And so for most people, at the point of integration, they're gonna see reality, they're gonna see themselves, they're gonna see, spirituality as being kind of like multifaceted. And it's at this point when people have had integration, you start to hear people saying things like, um, reality is both totally empty and also completely divine. Or reality is uh, totally dynamic and energetic and also empty, and also sacred. Or I can see how reality is co-constructed with my own mind and also completely, um, unified with God or something like that. People will use these words that sort of like show or express an integration between those kinds of experiences. Um, and so long term, if people have more than one thread open, the traditions, but also sort of I think maybe what happens naturally is this kind of like opening process, a deepening process that takes place with some kind of unique idiosyncratic form of braiding that blends into some kind of unique idiosyncratic form of integration where everything eventually comes together and is seen as kind of all facets of reality are seen simultaneously to be true. Um, and then the end of the model has a sort of a process of then dropping the threads or releasing the threads, where once your experience is so integrated, the threads have been completely sort of interwoven, then you can start to let go of them. You can start to let go of the perspectives and the identities and the worldviews that are associated with those threads. And so a lot of people kind of at this point start to, their spiritual perspectives and identities and ontologies just kind of like start falling away. They may have spent like decades in practice of certain kinds of traditions, had all sorts of experiences, and suddenly it's just like the spirituality just isn't mattering anymore. These kinds of experiences aren't mattering anymore. The realities or the worldviews that their spirituality had involved are just kind of like irrelevant. They're just falling away. Um, and a lot of people express at that point just kind of like going back into like ordinary the ordinary world, just kind of going back to work, going back to the marketplace and the Zen saying, right? And just sort of like leaving behind spirituality, um, and just sort of like, just being a normal human being, um, without all of the identities and ontologies and viewpoints and perspectives that had been so important for so long. Okay, so that's just kind of a quick summary of the rest of the model. We can maybe go into more detail on some of those things next time.
Mhm.
But yeah, let's have some questions.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Thank you for presenting the model in in that speed of time. It's perfect. And I can see, like, when I was listening to you, I mean, I'm aware, I know the process, but when you ended with integration and you started talking about release, I was like, oh God, it's still, I can still like the grief, or I can still like the sadness, a bit of it. Like when you have all these beautiful endpoints where so many traditions say this is it, yeah, or integration where you have this holographic view of the world and everything's integrated and you're just going through the world with all these different perspectives. I mean, that sounds so appealing and so amazing. And one would think like, this is it. This is the end. I want to be there 100% every day, every second of my life. But no, it's like it sounds like the perfect happy end. And then the release is like the epilogue. It's like, no, yeah. I mean, for some people it is. If you look around and you look to the teachers that are you find on YouTube, there are people now that you know the model, you can go to the YouTube videos and check them out and see like, oh, I think he's on the at the end of a oneness thread. Oh, no, I think he's at the end of the emptiness thread, and or he's an integration. And you won't find so many people who are in the release or who have released the threads. Usually, or many of them, they don't talk anymore because there is no use in talking about spirituality, so you don't see them. So
That's when
what
they
you
retire.
oh, they're retired, yeah. Because what you basically see is people at the endpoints or on the threads or in the integration, but you don't hear so much from people who have released the threads. So yeah.
Yeah, and when spirituality becomes irrelevant, then your spiritual
Yeah.
teacher job is sort of like irrelevant, and a lot of people sort of stop. But the thing I want to make sure that people are hearing um, in all of this is I'm not make remember I'm not creating a new model with a new hierarchy with a new kind of dogma to be believed in. And so I am not saying that like people who release the threads are better than people who are at other stages. I want to make sure that that's really clear. Similarly to what I was saying before, about the ecosystem, right? I think we need experts in all aspects of the model that I've laid out here. So we need experts in the emptiness thread who are like deep in the emptiness thread who are pointing the way there. We need experts in the oneness thread and the energy thread and the psyche thread who are like, really, really kind of like steeped in those views and steeped in those realities and those perspectives and are able to speak about those. We need people who are one threaders. We need people who are four threaders. We need people who are integrated. We need people who are released. We need people who are experts in the beginning of the model, the middle of the model, the end of the model. And none of those people are better than somebody who's never had an awakening to begin with, right? So just in terms of the model itself, it's not creating a hierarchy about who's further on than others. It's really just sort of like a celebration of the ecosystem, right? I'm like, hey, here's how the Serengeti works. There's hippos, there's hyenas, there's zebras and rhinos and whatever, and each of them has their own role to play in this ecosystem, right? It's more like that when I'm the picture I'm trying to paint. So yeah, so it's fun. Then you go online, you go on YouTube, and you're like, oh, there's a zebra and there's a rhino, right? And you can feel and see and hear the way people are talking, where they're, what positionality they are within the larger landscape. Um, and then if you're sort of like, a seeker, you're wanting to have certain kinds of experiences within that landscape, then that helps you to orient towards where you want to go. And it also helps you to bear in mind that when people start becoming fundamentalist, that you don't have to go there. You don't have to accept that. So I did want to mention a lamp unto yourself, which is a beginner's guide. So we've mentioned now Multidharma, the website multidharma.net, that has this kind of model written up in a more kind of mm, I guess abstract way, the way we've been talking about it here. But for somebody just sort of like starting out, new to spirituality, wanting to sort of like explore some practices and wanting to kind of like get started, not knowing where to start, that other book, Lamp Unto Yourself, is a starting point for that. A lamp unto yourself, and it's Yvonne's
This
got
is
the
how it looks like in my mailbox today. I haven't read it yet because it just arrived a few hours ago, but I'm looking forward to
So
it.
it doesn't have the word threads in it because I wrote it before I sort of elaborated the whole threads thing for the Multidharma book, but it's threads. It's got the threads separated out. It just doesn't call them threads.
Wonderful. Thank you
Great.
so much, Chris,
Yeah.
for your
Thank you. Thanks for organizing.
dedication and your time and your inspiration to bring up that model.
Yeah, I mean that's I hope I mean some people listen to this and be like, wow, that's so conceptual and like I don't want anything to do with that. That's cool, that's fine. That's just my own conditioning as a professor, as an intellectual, like that's what I have to offer is models. But my hope is that if you do get something out of this, it is that sense of like validation of your own experience and kind of like, oh, I can now sort of like see where everything kind of fits together and how I fit into the whole. So, because in my experience, I've seen that people are kind of naturally inclined towards certain threads and not others. Not everybody's the same in that respect. And some people are going to have like more facility with oneness than with emptiness. Other people are going to fall into emptiness really easily and not experience energy, right? For some people, the energy thread will be closed. They will not open it. They can have a full awakening all the way to to thread release without ever having, really kind of deeply experienced the energy thread. It's just kind of like everybody's different. And so if there's a space that values all those kinds of experiences, fabulous. And then just for you, don't judge yourself if you're not having this or that experience because your own configuration is unique to you. And you have to find the practices that are going to open you up in the way that you were designed to open up and nobody else. So for one person, it might mean Advaita style self-inquiry. For another person, it might be, Kundalini style stuff. For somebody else, it might be, Taoist meditations. Like who knows, right? We're all configured differently.
Good. So, thank you,
Cool.
everyone, and see you next time. Bye bye.
Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, everybody else. Yeah, great to be here with you.